right, well, since it is after 12 o'clock, we are going to get started with our presentation. My name is Erin Teggy. I am with the Glenview Northbrook Coalition for Youth, which is a local substance use prevention coalition focusing on keeping our youth in Glenview and Northbrook alcohol and drug free. And one of the most requested topics that we've had is social media. So we're really excited to be bringing this webinar to everyone here in our community. A few housekeeping things. If you have questions as we get started and kind of throughout the presentation, feel free to use that Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And if Dr. DeYoung does not answer those questions during his presentation, then we've saved some time at the end to hopefully be able to address those for everyone. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on the GNCY website, gncy.org, probably next week. Also, we will have a short survey at the end, which I will include the link in the chat as well as a follow-up email when this is all done. And we will also share the slides likely next week as well. So I'm very excited to be partnering with Rogers Behavioral Health and Dr. DeYoung on this topic. Dr. DeYoung is a licensed clinical psychologist and clinical supervisor with Rogers Behavioral Health. He trains and supervises many of the clinical staff who work in the partial hospitalization and intensive outpatient levels of care. His clinical focus is on treating anxiety disorders, and he has shared with me that he has presented on this topic many, many times, so we're really excited to hear his expertise to share with you all on this very, very important topic for our teens. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Dr. DeYoung, and we're so grateful that you're here and you can get started.
All right, well, thank you very much, Erin. It's much appreciated. I'm happy to be here. I wanted to thank everybody first for giving up an hour of their day and coming on in to talk with us and hear about this. We'll be talking a little bit about social media. We're going to be talking about lots of different aspects of it and how parents and kids can kind of coordinate to both educate and appropriately educate each other and appropriately use social media. I love during these presentations to have it a little bit more conversational than didactic. So please do make use of the Q&A box down at the bottom of the screen. The way that I've got my monitor set up right now, it's tough for me to see it. So if people are asking questions, Erin or Blair, please do feel free to speak up and let me know. I've built some time into the presentation so that people can ask questions at that moment, rather than necessarily having to wait till the end. I know if that happens to me, I'll tend to forget what it was that I wanted to ask. Broadly, whenever I give a presentation, I always like thinking about what one of my graduate school advisors told me: when you're giving a presentation, tell them what they're going to learn them, and then tell them what they did learn. So today we're going to talk about a little bit about development, how normal developmental processes can connect to the use of social media. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the research that's out there on social media and what we can learn from it, and then how to manage social media use day to day as a parent. So I know that many parents come to us and they say that they are concerned with their kids' social media use. It might be the frequency of that use. It might be what they're doing on social media. And the parents report being confused. They report being overwhelmed by all of this stuff. It's very difficult to keep up with the different ways that kids and teenagers are using social media. You know, back in the day when there was just, Facebook and MySpace to choose from, it was a little easier to monitor things. And now we've got new social media programs popping up everywhere. And we find that a little bit of education can go a long way toward helping parents, helping kids, and can actually provide a way for them to grow closer as they become a little bit more involved with one another around this particular topic. So we can think of ways to use social media to help that relationship between parents and kids. What we'll talk about in terms of education is going to be all evidence-based and scientifically supported. So everything that we're going to be talking about here has a basis for it in the psychological literature. So we aren't just kind of creating this out of whole cloth. We can point to the studies that have been done that show us this is something that we can do that will be very helpful. So very broadly, if we're talking about development, any kind of development comes from three areas when we're talking about human development: so biology, psychology, social development. So biological development, we're talking about here physical changes in the brain that lead to development of skills that are required to function. So learning, you're taking in, you're remembering, you're processing information as well as applying it, as well as inhibition. So how many of you have seen that kids and teens are typically not great at inhibiting certain actions, or sometimes might make choices that aren't the best? That's connects back to biology, it connects back to brain development. If we're thinking about psychological development, we change how we think as we develop. So our ability to interact with other people and even can think about ourselves becomes more nuanced and more complex. Our understanding of the nature of relationships begin to shift, and we kind of build on that progress as we get older. If we're thinking about social development, the ways in which we relate to and we interact with other people changes, and it becomes more complex. So we need more things, we need different things from social relationships as we develop and as we get older. And the things that we do need become more subtle. So things like love or safety might mean different things to somebody who's 8 years old, or somebody who's in their 40s, or somebody who's in their 80s. One of the pieces for biology, if we're thinking about the brain very broadly, we can break it down into three different parts. The hindbrain, the reptilian brain, this is where all of the automatic stuff happens. So we don't need to think about consciously, more often than not, breathing, having your veins and arteries dilate to maintain blood flow or balance. This is the stuff that's all automatic, it's all reflex. In our limbic brain, our midbrain, this is where emotions live. And if we're thinking about the forebrain, the neocortex, this is where your teens are developing the most, right? So again, we talked about seeing that kids and teens sometimes have difficulty making decisions. And the brain undergoes profound changes in function and in structure, with a lot of prefrontal connections kind of proliferating enormously in late childhood and early adolescence. And this is really what makes us us. It's where we have our higher functioning. It makes us capable of communication, lets us debate, lets us create works of art. And again, it helps us inhibit unhelpful impulses. This is kind of what makes us who we are. One thing that this area of the brain does, specifically during late childhood and during adolescence, is to help us learn to do one of the most single complicated tasks that we could possibly come up with. So it helps us navigate sociocultural learning. That is, how do we interact with one another socially? And this is a time for us to practice skills for navigating very complex social situations. Broadly, the research shows, do we see that there's an impairment in that skill set, an impairment in interacting with other people socially due to social media use, due to internet use, due to screen time? And we see broadly that the answer is no. Time spent online has not been found to significantly interfere with or take the place of other more normative developmental activities. We want to be sure to put that in context, where if somebody is predisposed to being anxious or being depressed, social media use could certainly be a factor in intensifying either of those things. But broadly, time spent online doesn't impact those developmental activities. And the research indicates that there are likely going to be new skills that are learned by everybody in the age of interconnectedness. Those skills are going to be reflected in the architecture of our brains, but that it has a profound effect on brain development is not something that we need to worry about. Thinking about broadly psychological development, we'll take a look at how we think about the teenage stage of life. Something to keep in mind is that there are an incredible number of factors that are at work here. So many different aspects of a person's life, what they experience, and how they experience it really all work to ultimately produce a particular person with a particular way of interacting with the world. And even then, those ways of interacting with the world can change. And I always want to caution people, if you're ever online and you're looking for something to explain, well, I see this or I see that, frequently you'll find kind of more pop psychology articles that propose pretty direct explanations, pretty simple explanations. Kids do this or they're like that because of X. And I would encourage you not to accept those simple explanations, or kind of take them with a grain of salt, because chances are there are many, many things going on with that teenager. And the one factor that you're reading about or encountering there can be put in the appropriate context of just being one factor among many. So if we're thinking about development in adolescence, there are two major developmental tasks, and one of them is something called identity formation, right? So I'm going to connect with myself. I'm going to figure myself out. So I'm going to clarify who I am and how I'm similar to or how I'm different from other people. I'm going to figure out my tastes. I'm going to figure out my preferences, my sensibilities. I'm going to start to figure out who I am, and I'm going to use this to move with a particular purpose or a particular direction in life. So over one's life, there's likely going to be a certain degree of sameness and continuity over time, despite changes that they might go through, right? We might have physical changes. I might get taller. My appearance might change. I might have shifting preferences or interests that I might have or I might develop. I might have things that happen due to environmental changes, like moving to a new place to live. But I'm really going to get a sense of who I am in adolescence. I'm going to figure myself out. When we're thinking about development in psychology, one of the models that's out there is by someone named Erik Erikson. He maintains that one's personality develops in a particular order, or a predetermined order, where each stage kind of builds on the next. So according to him, successful completion of each of these stages results in a healthy personality, and it prepares us to deal with situations in the future. And the way that he has it here is there's kind of this little struggle or dialectic or difference between kind of two major things. We're looking kind of at the middle of this little chart here. We're looking at identity versus role confusion. Again, who am I? So during adolescence, kids are becoming more independent. They're starting to look to the future. They're looking at and starting to think about things like their careers, their relationship, what they're going to do, where they're going to live. They want to belong to society. They want to fit in. And so they want to start to define who they're going to be as an adult. They want to be more certain about their place in society. So really, if we're thinking about adolescence, we're thinking about kind of trying on these different identities and trying to define ourselves. You could think about teenagers trying to do different things, like they're putting on different clothes, they're putting on different hats, right? And so I will give everybody a minute to see if they might use that Q&A piece, or to unmute yourself, and that's the social phobia portion of our show, to maybe share some of this stuff. I would ask you guys, how did you define yourselves when you were teenagers? You say, I am this kind of person, or I would want to be that kind of person. Or the question that I really like asking everybody is, what did you have on your bedroom wall? What were the posters that were on there? I'll give everybody just a little bit. We'll see if anybody posts anything. And if not, I'll make some embarrassing confessions myself. So Aaron or Blair, please do let me know if somebody put something. What was on your bedroom?
Sure, we have some ballet posters.
Perfect.
Duran, Madonna, pop culture.
Very nice.
Those types of things.
I typically get, for parents that I'm talking to in their 30s, mid 30s, I get a lot of New Kids on the Block, a lot of U2. Good.
We have two Farrah Fawcett's.
Excellent, Farrah Fawcett. I was and continue to be a huge Star Wars fan, so I had Star Wars posters up on my bedroom wall. So you might say that when I defined myself as a teenager, that piece stuck.
We have some Olympic hockey team,
Very nice.
some Tiger Beats, Star Wars.
And I would encourage you, as you're thinking about this stuff, if you're kind of conjuring up these things that were on your wall, if you feel a little twinge of like, oh, that's a little embarrassing, that's a little different than what I am now, or like me, if you're thinking about the Star Wars posters that were on your wall and they've just moved to another room of your house instead of your bedroom, you can think, okay, in the former case, I'm a little bit different than I was when I was a teenager, but in the latter case, maybe some of the stuff stuck, and that was something that I've really adopted and I've integrated into my personality. Thank you very much, guys. The other major developmental task of adolescence is establishing a relationship, so making connections with other people. So if we're thinking about kind of, what makes a relationship, what makes somebody a friend, really what we're thinking about is connecting with a group of people who have similar experiences, who have similar interests, with which we can identify and in which we can feel accepted. So in adolescence, we're really developing and testing out our ability to connect with others. So you can think of our lives at that point as kind of a laboratory where we're trying out different ways of interacting with others and seeing whose styles of interactions fit with ours. And we're frequently changing what we do and who we might prefer to interact with so we can find out what works. And one of the researchers had kind of defined this as finding a tribe. And I like the way that is said, because we're all looking for a place to connect and a place to fit in. There's a hypothesis out there, the social brain hypothesis, that talks about that the reason that we've developed one of the proportionally biggest brains on the face of the earth is to navigate one of the most complex social situations on earth. So like we discussed before, this lets us do things that only human beings can do, but it also lets us organize into groups, right? Family, places that you work, sports teams, and that allows us to support one another. And so you think, so what? Well, we're thinking back to when our distant ancestors lived in a world with a lot of predators all over the place. You might think that the reason that this worked was that there was safety in numbers, right? I don't need to be faster than the saber-toothed tiger. I just need to be faster than you. And you'd be partially correct, but that's not the whole picture. So there's safety in numbers, yes, but safety in socially connected numbers. So humans as a whole, we can do a lot, but we're not that great at physically defending ourselves compared to other mammals. I would challenge you to think of any other mammal that if it were really, really angry with you and wanted to hurt you, it would probably be able to do it, even though you might ultimately prevail, even if you're talking about something small. So we're not that great at physically defending ourselves. We stand up and our soft underbelly is right there and our organs are all not protected by us hunching over and having our rib cage and our spine protect us. So we've evolved to select traits that bind us together, that help us adapt, that help us survive. Survival in socially connected numbers means that we've got other people who we're connected to that are really ready, willing, and able to help us out. There are studies out there that have shown that we're actually able to tolerate stress better if we have other people in our lives. So there's a stress hormone called cortisol. It's higher when we're in stressful situations alone than when we're in a stressful situation with other people, even if those people are strangers. So we can measure objectively through that level of cortisol that stress isn't as stressful, pain isn't as painful when we have other people in our lives. And the converse is also true, that studies are showing that social isolation is a health and a longevity risk factor that's been found to be just as risky as smoking is to long-term health. So the specific tools might have changed, the rules of social engagement might have gotten more complicated, but the fundamental psychological mechanisms behind child development, teen development, are identical to what has been studied for many years. So when we're thinking about social media, not a lot of this stuff is very new, except how people are interacting. So the internet is this portal to an almost infinite amount of opportunities to explore lots of different areas. We talked about finding a tribe. And a good way to think about the internet, a good way to think about social media use is that we have more tribes to choose from and we have greater access to them. And so, we can find things that are extraordinarily specific and connect with those groups of people. And it's something that hasn't been necessarily available for a very long time. I grew up in the 80s and 90s, and I certainly didn't have anything like this. I would have to, go within my pre-existing friend group, or, find some person who knew someone else if there was something that was a common interest that we had that we would want to do together. I am a gigantic board game nerd, and one of my favorite board games is something that takes 8 hours to play. And I miss doing this in person because I can look out in the audience, because most people go, "Oh, that sounds gross," and a couple of people go, "Oh, that sounds kind of interesting." And the point is, I'm able to find groups of people who do like that thing, who do find it interesting because of all of the connectivity that we experience. So the fundamental questions that people are asking themselves, that desire to develop interconnectedness, to develop their identity, they're very well known in psychology. Not much is new in terms of what kids do, what teenagers do in adolescence in terms of relating to these kind of common developmental tasks. So we're looking for people who are similar to us in the way that they think and the way that they want to do things. We look for opportunities to kind of let our guard down and relax or escape the daily grind. We look for opportunities to do things that are entertaining and have fun. We look for opportunities to learn about ourselves and learn about the world. Thinking back to everybody on this call, your experience with what that was like in adolescence, my guess is those themes sound pretty similar. You would probably be able to easily pick out some examples of relaxing or escaping or having fun or learning about yourself. The only difference is, right now, it's being done more online. So again, what is being done is pretty similar to how it's always been done, but how it's being done is a little bit different. We'll talk a little bit about some of the research that's out there. There is an article out there that was first published in The Atlantic by Twenge, and that was one of the authors that kind of started the ball rolling on a lot of the perception of social media as something that was not great, something that really caused a lot of problems and didn't have a lot of benefit. And the conclusion that she had reached in her article was that all screen activities were linked to less happiness and all non-screen activities were linked to more happiness. And again, I would urge you to be very careful as you're reading that article, because we found that certain things correlate, but we don't know that it's causal, right? So I've absolutely met clients who struggle with kind of digital life, right? People who are overwhelmed by the constant presence of technology. They get themselves in trouble managing the demands of social media, or because their judgment or impulse control isn't as great as it might be. And from what I've seen, kids aren't simply mindlessly attached to their phones. Their worlds aren't confined to those screens, nor would they want them to be. The kids that I've worked with typically need help developing strategies to deal with distress. And that distress might be in some way occasionally linked to social media. But broadly, these aren't people who are going to have their lives upended by taking a trip to the Apple store. So again, this really kind of gets back to how to scare with statistics. When people are doing research studies, they'll find these correlations. A is linked to B, but I'll give away the story here. In psychology, most everything is linked to everything else. You're likely going to be able to find a correlation. And you've got to keep in mind that this isn't causal. So a lot of the stuff that we find in these studies is that what's reported by kids are consistent with normal development, right? Kids will report being depressed. Kids will report being anxious. Kids will report being lonely. And these are normal things that happen during adolescence. This is not something that's new. If we look just kind of at the numbers for how many kids are using social media right now, we're looking at over 90% of American adolescents use it. And these are the folks that are between 12 and 17. And what we see that they're doing is they're primarily doing things with folks they already know, right? They found that tribe. This is just the way that they are interacting with them. We find that they do things that we would predict. They're typically sending emails, instant messages, or texts, like we talked about with the normative development experiences. They're finding ways to have fun or be entertained. They're finding ways to learn things. And broadly, they're avoiding being bored. And I want to put a pin in that so we can have you guys remember it for a little bit later. I'm going to put in a plug for being bored and about how boredom can be a very good thing. One of the researchers that I will absolutely recommend that if anybody's interested in learning about social media is Dana Boyd. She's a researcher in the field. She's got a couple of books out that are great for anyone that wants to educate themselves about this. One of her books is called It's Complicated, The Social Lives of Networked Teens. So if you just search for Boyd, It's Complicated, her book will likely come up. And, what we find currently, there's a higher incidence now of both parents working, a higher incidence, more time of kids spent in kind of after school or post-school programs. Public places are more difficult to access. And having written that previous part before last March, we're also in the middle of a pandemic. So kids can't do a lot of the stuff in person that they would normally want to do. And Dana Boyd has this great quote that I like to talk about when I'm talking about social media, is that the kids aren't addicted to their phones necessarily. They are addicted to each other. That is, they're addicted to the sense of interconnectedness that can result from using social media. So she argues that social media is not as threatening as parents think it is, and it provides teenagers with a space to express their feelings and their ideas without judgment. So again, we're talking about finding a tribe. This is giving us access to more tribes and easier access to those tribes. So what we see is actually when given the choice, there's a significant proportion of kids and of teens who believe that social media or technology actually tends to be a barrier when they're interacting with other people. So by using a moment to engage in social media, or I think likely feeling the obligation to use social media, doing that interferes with what they would want to do. So having desired or preferred interactions be face-to-face. So we'll talk about this a little bit later, but social media may be a way for us to connect, but it's also an industry, one that's designed to keep us online and keep us using social media as much as possible. Teens are especially vulnerable to this. Again, their frontal lobes are still coming online, so they might need help recognizing that particular piece of context. We also see that when teens do get the opportunity to meet face-to-face, use of social media is pervasive enough that it can take away from those interactions too. I ask you guys to kind of do a little mental exercise. How many people have been speaking with someone? And I'm uncertain if Zoom has a hand-raising feature, so we'll see if that's the case. I love polling the audience to see what folks think about this. How many of you have been speaking with someone and right as you're talking to them, they pull out their phone to check something, right? Typically people report feeling frustrated or dismissed or ignored. I'd also wonder, if we're sitting here watching each other in all of these different boxes, how many of you have been on an online call and you've kind of done one of these and you've kind of tried to surreptitiously check your phone without anybody knowing or noticing? So given what we've talked about earlier, so social connections enable us to be better able to tolerate distress. It very much makes sense that wanting to be in touch with their friends is something that kids and teens want to do. They're on a trajectory to eventually leave their families, head out into a world that might be scary, it might be complex, and they need one another in order to practice to be able to do it. And again, they're not addicted to their phones, they're addicted to one another. So thinking of the research that we've discussed, if we have a predisposition to seek out others, social media can be thought of as a new way to do a very old thing. So teens are wired to figure out how to have social relationships because those relationships are beneficial to us. And this will be the last piece of research that we'll talk about, kind of about 20 years or more of data shows that looking at one of the longest running assessments of teen happiness in the United States. This is a survey that's given out yearly to teenagers graduating 12th grade, getting ready to go to college, shows that these numbers are pretty solid with relatively little variation since the mid to late 90s. That's before social media gained widespread use. And what they show is the red up at the top are kids that rate themselves as being pretty happy, yellow is very happy, and then at the bottom, green is not happy. Teen happiness has remained pretty solid. The numbers agree with what we typically see in epidemiological studies for mental illness. So the take-home message is that I think while social media can indeed affect kids, it broadly has not caused a unique effect as a group to kids. We would see a decrement, we would see a decrease. The lines would go up or down respectively for the kids that are rating themselves as happy versus not, if things like social media and interconnectedness were causing this pervasive effect, and we don't see that. Any questions at the moment? So that kind of gets the developmental piece, the research piece out of the way, and we'll talk a little bit about managing social media use. So does anyone have any questions before we go to the next part?
No questions so far.
If you have them, please put them on there, let us know. For the next part, I'd like to go over some strategies for managing social media use. So we'll talk a little bit about how parents can best prepare themselves and approach their kids to discuss social media. It can be pretty difficult to model for your kids, and we'll talk a little bit about how social media is, again, designed to have people keep using it, and adults are no exception. It can be a struggle to do these things yourself in order to be an appropriate example for your kids. The good news is, once you start looking at social media in a different way, you'll likely notice that your relationship with it changes, likely in a way that's going to help you function. So social media is everywhere. It's happening all the time. I would ask you, who on this call has already checked their phone? Who has wanted to check their phone? I mean, I've wanted to check my phone. I'm the one giving the presentation, and a couple of slides ago, my phone buzzed, and I think it's a package that I'm waiting for, but I'm going to wait. We know that it's tough to break habits, especially habits that have been reinforced. We know that the use of phones is positively reinforced, and it's been negatively reinforced. If we're thinking about positive reinforcement, something happens that makes something more likely. So I use my phone, I find out that I'm on social media, I've got a bunch of likes or thumbs up or shares or things like that. Friends, family members, whoever are giving me those things, that makes me feel good. That way, I want to do more of that. I want to do more things that will get me shares or thumbs up or likes. It's also negatively reinforced. If we think about negative reinforcement, we're thinking about how something can make us feel less bad, less down. So if I am not feeling so great, and I typically turn to social media to take my mind off of not feeling that great, that's going to be negatively reinforced. And so something that is both positively and negatively reinforced can be very powerful. And so one of the best ways for parents to approach this is to treat it as something to learn about, rather than something that right out of the gate is bad or wrong or something we don't want. And not only here, where we're kind of learning about it, but when you're interacting with your kids and you're talking to them about social media. So really, one of the secrets is we as parents need to become conversant with and stay updated about social media. And that can be extraordinarily difficult to do. We'll talk a little bit more about this in a couple of slides, but we want to make sure that the stuff that's out there is things that we know about, things that we understand, and things that as they change, we're working with our kids to make sure we know how they're changing, that we know what the most popular thing is that they're using, because it changes almost day to day. So one of the strategies that I find most successful is really helping the kids take on the role of being a teacher, and parents taking on a role that some parents typically don't take on around kids, being honest, being humble about what you don't know, saying that you don't understand this thing, right? So you're not going to understand all of the details about how or why or the specific form that it takes when kids use social media. They'll need to explain it to you, and you still won't get all of it, right? A quote from a patient that I worked with, she had asked her son about Snapchat streaks, right? So he could explain that to her. And that way they could grow a little closer. She could learn about something that was important to and interesting to him, and she would be able to be conversant about it. My own experience, I think I'm pretty computer savvy, but I'm behind the times when it comes to social media. Like I said before, typically when I'm talking to people in this kind of audience, people are usually in their early 30s to early 40s. I had parents that after they got me a Nintendo when I was 7 years old, that's what they called every single other video game system I've ever had. Could you pause the Nintendo? It's not a Nintendo, it's an Xbox, right? But that's who we are becoming now when we're talking about social media. So people will typically ask, can you give me a list? Can you give me, what's going on right now with social media? And I would, but anything that I could give you would probably be obsolete by 12 o'clock by the time the talk was over. So the best thing that we can do is ask your kids. And then just to underscore that, I'm talking about here Snapchat streaks. I put these slides together a little while ago. Snapchat isn't as popular as it once was. Now it's lots of different stuff. So best way to get the latest, greatest information, ask your kids. So how do we want to frame this, really? We want to frame this as collaborating with your kids about how to decrease or limit access. It can open an important dialogue, if that's what we want to talk about the impacts of social media and what they might want to change. We also want to keep in mind that eliminating access to the use of social media, particularly now, as people have been using this as a primary social outlet in ever increasing numbers since the pandemic began, it's likely going to result in people feeling more stressed out, people feeling more disconnected from others, which is what they're trying to reduce by using this in the first place. So we want to balance that with the fact that, again, their frontal lobes are coming online, and we need to monitor that for a little while longer. So teens are still developing, and social media really grew out of entertainment and advertising for adults. And kids don't yet have the skills to navigate it. Social media is an industry. It wants to put eyeballs on screens. It wants people to see advertisements and go buy things. It's sold as a way to connect with one another, but it's ultimately a part of a system that's designed to generate revenue. And I would ask, would you trust anybody to make appropriate decisions in that environment without the appropriate context, without having other points of view? Studies show that being part of kind of an interconnected network of other people, it absolutely helps people solve problems. It can facilitate the dissemination of information, but being a part of that network doesn't teach the skills that are needed to verify that the information that's coming at you is accurate. Also doesn't teach you how to get accurate information on your own, which is where parents can step in and provide that knowledge. We want to make sure that we're educating our kids about privacy on social media, especially privacy settings. It might seem basic, but we do want to make sure to go over it. We want to educate them to be aware of their audience. There's something called context collapse, and teens who use social media frequently encounter this. So they might have an intended audience or recipient of something that they post, but that post goes to or it's seen by other people. So they might forget that, say, they had friended a particular relative or a teacher, and then they post something that they might not want that person to see. And the adult equivalent, I think, would be forgetting that you friended your boss and then making some sort of inappropriate comment on social media where they could see it. Additionally, we need to educate kids that when something's put online, it's basically out in the world forever, right? You can take posts down, but other people may have already seen them, or other people might have copied the content that that teenager might no longer want to be out there. So one of the things that we can do is we can put limits on phone use that support values, right? So one of those values might be getting good sleep. Anybody who comes into the clinic, one of the first things that we teach them is, in addition to if you're anxious or if you're depressed, is how are you taking care of yourself physically? Are you exercising? Are you getting enough sleep? Getting enough sleep is something that is absolutely critical for good mental health. So our behavior around bed and the bedroom, going to sleep, creates cues for how we're predisposed to being awake or being asleep. And we need to be careful and consistent about how we deal with those cues. So it's something we don't just see with screen use, but for people, behavioral strategies that we use tend to be applicable to almost everyone. So being on the phone is a very wakeful activity. People are active, they're engaged, they're processing a lot of information that's interesting. When they're using their phones, a lot of high frequency blue light is coming out from the display, which kind of tricks your brain into thinking that it's closer toward the middle of the day than it should be. So your brain is releasing stimulants that'll keep you awake. So we don't want that to be an option around bedtime. Ideally, we'd be taking phones out of rooms. You'll probably hear, but I use my phone as an alarm clock. Great, get an old-fashioned alarm clock. We have found that if we're putting a curfew on phones about an hour and a half before bed and getting the phones out of the room, kids sleep better and they feel better. It might seem pretty simple, but one of the things that we recommend putting in place at least a couple of times a week, if not more, is protecting a time to gather as a family and spend time together, spend time discussing the day. And one thing that's very suited to this is dinner time. We want to make sure that dinner is a time to kind of take a hiatus from screens. Prior to the pandemic, I would go out, I would eat, and I would be sitting at a restaurant. I would be stunned at how many families at the end of the day were all sitting around the same table, and it was totally silent, and everybody's got their phone out, and they're all in their own little world on their individual screens. No one was talking with each other. And by protecting this time, by having these dinners with family or with friends, they're associated with better academic performance, increases in self-esteem, and lower risk of things like substance abuse, teen pregnancy, eating disorders, obesity. So there's a lot of upside to doing this, especially because you get to kind of connect or reconnect with family members at the end of the day. I had talked earlier about how I'm going to put in a plug for boredom, and I will put that plug in now. It's a great motivator for hobbies, and I think limiting phone use generates that boredom because our phones don't allow us, our social media doesn't allow us to be bored. There's always something that we can look at, something that we can do, something that we can respond to. And boredom, like I said, is a great motivator. And so generating boredom really pushes teenagers out to develop skills, to learn how to think critically, and to exist in society. And I would ask all of you, how many of you right now have hobbies that you really, really enjoy, but you don't spend as much time on them as you used to, or as much time as you want to? Because at the end of the day, you get home and you've finished your day, you're tired. Oh, well, maybe I could do that thing. And how many of you pull out your phone and you're on your phone all evening, or you're using a tablet, or you're on a computer? I think sometimes we can get taken away from those things that we enjoy. That's a critical component for mental health by using social media. So putting some limits on that is typically a good thing. We typically want to recommend that for kids when they're using their phones, and this is hard to enforce sometimes, that about 90 minutes to 2 hours a day should be just about the maximum amount of time that they're concentrating on that screen for the phone. Ideally, anything more than that is going to have them get stuck, have them get away from hobbies they enjoy, have them get away from more meaningful interactions with folks. There is a movement out there called Wait Until 8th. We've been talking about brain development for kids. Usually around 8th grade is the target for when kids have developed enough to be able to interact with social media responsibly or appropriately. One thing that this Wait Until 8th movement has done is every major carrier of a phone is going to make a phone with text and call capacity, but nothing else, no access to the internet, no access to social media, but they will still look like everybody else's phone. And there's a movement out there where some parents are getting their kids these phones, so they won't look any different than any of their friends, but their access to it might be limited. So many folks would disagree with me for raising this issue at all. A lot of folks think that monitoring phones is an invasion of privacy. So we can see this can kind of be on a spectrum, right? Checking in verbally to installing monitoring apps on phones. I have friends who have done the latter. They've been able to see when their kids are doing things and what their kids are doing. Some clinicians see that this is a significant invasion of privacy. This would be kind of akin to a couple of decades ago of picking up another phone line, listening into a conversation that somebody's having. And this kind of parental surveillance is a form of something that's going to limit teens' abilities to make choices and also drive a wedge between you and them if they find out about it. And for me personally, as we know that kids don't suddenly come on the scene with all of their executive functioning fully developed, so judgment, impulse control, critical thinking, I think some monitoring and mostly modeling of smartphone use is warranted. So one thing that I would recommend, if we are going to do some direct monitoring, pardon me, we need to approach it carefully. We need to be respectful about it. There are two major principles for modeling, or rather for monitoring. We need to be transparent and we need to back it up. If we're thinking about being transparent, if for no other reason, it's futile not to. People are great at figuring out if someone has been on their phone, and kids tend to be much better at it than adults, so you're going to get caught. And if you get caught, this breach of trust poses some significant risk. So parents will compromise their relationship with their kid, and that relationship, among all of the factors on somebody's life, is critically protective during teenage years. So a good relationship between a teen and their parents can stave off any number of bad influences and outcomes. So you absolutely want to maintain it. You're also modeling sneaky behavior. So once a teenager sees that, they're going to start to emulate it. And that's precisely what we want to avoid. So if teens know that parents are kind of being sneaky or clandestine about poking around on their phones, they're just going to get very clever about hiding their behaviors. Parents are going to be prevented from detecting things that are unsafe. So said another way, if parents thought that the teen world of the internet was complicated or difficult to understand or opaque before, remember, what you've seen to date is the result of your teenager being open with you about it. We also want people to be able to back it up, right? Why are you guys able to monitor it? Well, because, Billy, because you have these accounts, you're doing a lot of stuff that, you find interesting. You're doing things that you find helpful. I want to be part of that. I want to be able to support you. I want to be able to help you. And then at the other end of the spectrum, being able to monitor them because you're footing the bill for it. But whichever way you want to approach it for, I'd recommend the former. But we would want to make sure that as kids are using social media, using screens, that is a piece of it, that we are monitoring, that we are involving ourselves in order to help them be able to develop the skills that they need to interpret what's going on. The stuff that we're looking for while we're monitoring, we want to make sure that we're looking for things that are inappropriate, where people are saying inflammatory things. They might be posting inappropriate pictures, but things that, again, they're going to be online forever. And some teenagers might need our help to learn that. We also want to check in with them about behaviors like bullying or being bullied, or and how this can extend to outside of school hours. It's if you've got social media and there are bullies at school, there's this piece of cyberbullying that can extend beyond the normal school day. And especially now, because we've got the pandemic on and social media tends to be one of the primary, if not the primary way that teenagers are interacting with one another. And we'll look at some examples here. We want to keep an eye open for conflict. So getting into fights, interacting with other people in a way you typically wouldn't expect, or that go against the rules in your house. We typically hear about things like vague booking or subtweeting. Subtweeting is the online equivalent of talking about someone online behind their back. So on social media, this is when you say something or do something and you don't tag someone or you don't @ someone while you're talking about them, so they don't know that you're saying it. For things like vague booking, it's an intentionally vague statement that prompts people to put their eyes on that statement and reach out to that person. So if I'm vague booking, I'm posting things that are intentionally vague in order to kind of pique other people's interests. So I'm going to say something online, so people will ask me about it. And it might be attention seeking, but it might also be a sign that there is indeed something that's going on where someone might need help. And I mention this in order to help put it in your awareness to monitor for statements like that with your kids and be aware that they might see things like that from their friends online. So what are we looking for, right? When we say vague, we're not talking about the things that your relative who just learned how to use social media tends to post, right? It's not things like, I'm standing in line at the store, or I'm just hanging around the house today. We're looking for things that might be more emotionally charged or have vague references to feeling sad or anxious or resigned, or things that are expressing regret. These are important things that if we see that our kids or our kids' friends are doing them, it's probably worth taking a look. And As we're aware of it, it'll help to teach our kids to be aware of it. So your kids are going to see these things, and you can take that role of appropriately putting these things in context. So this could be a great opportunity to normalize these thoughts and these experiences for your kids. You can tell them people have these thoughts and reactions sometimes. It's okay to have them. It's okay to feel sad. It's okay to feel anxious or frustrated. But if people are thinking these things or doing these things, your kids or other friends that they might see online, if they're doing these things to such an extent that it gets in their way of their day to day, so interacting with family, friends, or interacting at school, that's when we need to know that it's also okay to ask for help. And we can put into context how to respond to seeing these posts. They can be a great tool for instilling empathy and kindness with opportunities for friends to appropriately support one another. We can also use it as an example of how when things are posted online, they tend not to be private. People will typically ask how much is enough, and I'll give you the therapist answer of it depends. How much is enough is kid by kid after they've shown that they're able to use social media responsibly, positively, pro-socially, however it is that we want to define that. And that'll vary from family to family, parent to parent, and kid to kid. Once they're able to show that they're able to use it responsibly, then I would say we can start to walk back the monitoring, kind of making it the occasional check-in with our kids. One thing that I want to stress is that this is all going to start with you guys. One of the most powerful ways to help your kids develop better social media use is to model it yourselves. Let the kids see that you've got the capability to use it appropriately and to also disconnect from the constant barrage that it gives you. I'd encourage you, take these ideas, try them out yourselves. My guess is you're going to feel better. You're going to feel more connected to those around you. So having said that, I'm going to take a drink of water and see if any of you guys have any questions.
So there are a few questions that people have asked. There's a couple relating to kids engaging with each other. So one of the examples was, a group of kids are together, but yet they're still sitting on their phone and staring at their phones while they're together. And then there was another similar kind of question and comment about spending hours and hours on YouTube watching like football or watching the blogger, and how are those situations helping them connect with each other?
I think that's the piece of it, right? We need to provide that context because I think you can have active social media use and you can have passive social media use in addition to active kind of general internet use and passive internet use. And we want, if it's going to happen, typically more of the former and less of the latter, where if I'm just kind of sitting there and soaking things in or constantly watching, football, or I'm watching people stream things, or I'm just watching videos online, I'm not really kind of developing, I think, the skills that I need to develop them. That's where we want to think about having those limits where, X number of minutes per day, we can absolutely do that, but also giving people a chance to do other things and expand their horizons. That's what we'll want to look at. So kind of monitoring what they're doing. I think this is a good opportunity for, parents to kind of involve themselves and say, hey, well, how much during the day are you using this stuff? And when you are, how are you using it? Are you connecting directly with people? Or is it more kind of passive? We find that passive use of all this stuff typically tends to get connected to people not feeling that great, typically gets connected to people feeling a little more isolated or depressed or anxious. And the people who are using it actively and they're interacting with friends or family members, those tend to be the folks who are feeling a little bit less anxious, a little bit less depressed. Hopefully that answers your question.
Great. There's a few kind of like not logistical questions, but there's some about like, how do you know when to allow your child to have, say, an Instagram account if they're in 8th grade, or looking at other apps about kind of tracking and monitoring, or are there apps that alert you to suspicious activity?
In terms of kind of the tracking and monitoring apps, I would always be as upfront as possible, as soon as possible. And I would make the agreement with the kids, like, look, I'm somebody who cares deeply for you and your well-being. I want to make sure that you are exposed to the things you need to be exposed to, and that you're not putting yourself inadvertently in a situation that might be risky. And one of the ways that we can do that is I can try and monitor what's going on. That will look like this. It'll involve me, checking in with you, or it'll involve me installing something on your phone. Pardon me. These are the ways that I want to be able to, work with you and keep you safe. And I think kind of framing it that way typically gives you a leg up on being able to have them buy into it. And again, I would say, it varies family by family, person by person, where as they have demonstrated that they can use social media appropriately, right? If you find that they are able to question things that they see without immediately just, buying whatever it is that somebody posts, if they're able to post things that are appropriate versus inappropriate, if they're able to kind of point out like, oh, my friends are using social media in some not great ways, those are good signs for your kids' development to see that they're taking this seriously and that they're learning what they need to learn. But it's going to vary from family to family. So I would say setting right out at the outset, saying, here's what I would need to see from you in order for me to pull some of this back. And knowing that I'm still going to be checking in with you every so often anyway.
All right, another question was asking about important strategic differences when managing general social media alongside a behavioral health issue like anxiety or ADHD or eating disorder.
Mm-hmm. So the good news is, if you are going to a treatment facility or a provider worth their salt, they will work this into a treatment plan. And much like anybody who comes in through our doors, I want to make sure that we are tailoring the treatment right to the person who's getting it. So if we're finding that particular social media use, if it's a particular app, if it's using social media to the exclusion of doing other things, if it's I'm up at all hours of the night and I'm not sleeping because I'm constantly checking this stuff for whatever reason, that would be when we would want to put some specific limits in place. For people, for example, who are anxious, if somebody has, say, OCD and they feel the need to check social media for something, we might find that they're using it extensively and to the exclusion of doing much else. And a good treatment for that piece would be, let's try not using it. It will likely make you feel a little bit of distress, but you're going to be able to teach yourself that you can disconnect from that and you can handle that distress without kind of using social media to artificially bring your distress down. So again, a good provider is going to wrap this into the treatment plan. It'll vary from kid to kid based on how much they're using, but we absolutely do see sometimes that kids who come in with a comorbid mental health condition and social media is a factor, that is always something that we talk about with them. It's always something that we talk about their parents, with their parents, and make sure it's part of treatment.
Okay, great. Hopefully we have time for one or two more. This one hopefully will be quick. Going back to that happiness graph that you had showed, is there that data went through 2015? Someone was asking if there was anything more current, just because it seems like in the last 5 years, there's a lot more social media out there.
I am actually looking for that as we speak. That was the most recent information that I've had that has that much data, but I'm trying to find some. And when I do, I will disseminate that.
Wonderful, thank you. Another question, if you have seen the Social Dilemma documentary on Netflix, and what your reaction to that documentary with the central theme that you are the product.
I haven't seen that particular one, but I have seen one called, I believe is it Like? Which is, it's the Facebook one. I can't remember. Blair, if you remember which.
Yes, it's called Like.
Thank you. Where it talks about how social media it's an industry, and it's an industry that is incredibly powerful and cagey and really designs everything it possibly can to put eyeballs on screens. And there are certain ways that we can interact with our social media to kind of help us disconnect a little bit. One of the things that is recommended is actually just putting on your phone, putting it on black and white mode every so often during the day, because that takes away red notification that people typically get that we see. And, making some very simple changes tend to enable us to use these things a little bit less. But yeah, it's a huge industry that's run by some very intelligent people who really, really want people to keep using it. And that makes it pretty tough for adults and kids to kind of separate from it, because they use all of these different little psychological tricks in order to keep us engaged, keep us using it. So I'll have to check out the other one on Netflix.
All right, and it is after 1 o'clock, so if people have to, hop off, feel free. There is a link in the chat for a short survey about today's presentation. There's one last question, Dr. DeYoung, if you have time to answer real quick.
Sure.
The last one that we have is, what's the evidence for the effects of phone use on attention and cognition in adolescent development?
I would wonder what evidence they're looking for specifically. Typically, the studies will find that depending on what you're looking at, different aspects of cognition might be affected, different aspects of being able to consistently pay attention. A lot of kind of attention training has been studied that gets related to phone use. So typically people who are using their phones more often, they're constantly switching what it is that they're looking at or they're paying attention to. We have found in some studies that it's harder for people to sustain their attention elsewhere. They're used to shifting their attention constantly. So when they're doing things, like homework or interacting with other people, it tends to be a little bit more difficult for them. In terms of specific studies, if folks have particular questions, I'd be happy to take a look and see what I can find out there.
Okay, great. Well, that is all we have today. Thank you everyone for hopping on. We hope that everyone learned, and thank you, Dr. DeYoung, for sharing your expertise on this really important topic. I will be emailing out everything to all the participants, so be looking for an email next week. So enjoy everyone's weekend, and a happy Thanksgiving.
Thanks, Erin. Thanks for organizing.
Of course.